So let me start here. It's a really great pleasure for me to host Kala Wimmer, the current president of the American Committee on Asian Economic Studies and former editor of the Journal of Asian Economics from 2015-2020. This is a very interesting story about this event with Elsevier. So it's a good story. It's on Kala's page. Kala is a PhD got his PhD from University of Wisconsin in Madison and had former positions at University of Hawaii, Nankai University, National University of Singapore, University of Philippines, had times at UCS and UCLA, consulted for the American government, for China government, and so on. And nowadays, beyond the president of the American Committee on Asian Economic Studies, she also is in charge of the Asia Economics blog, who publishes interesting things about East Asian and Asian economics in general. So it's a very big pleasure to have Kala with us, and she will talk to us about if the macroeconomics from for East Asian economies also applies to Latin American economies. It is about related to her book on macroeconomics for East Asian economies. So we'll try to have 1 hour of a presentation, then question and answers. So Kala, feel free if you take the time you need. If you need more time than this 1 hour, feel free. We have plenty of time. So Kala, it's with you. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
And thank you very much, Roberto, for inviting me. You're my old friend, and it's wonderful to reconnect with you in this way. I hope someday we can do it in Brazil, in person. I would love to visit your country. And thank you also, Professor Marcelo Braga, for the invitation, and to Anpec for hosting this event and giving me this opportunity to speak to people on the other side of the world. Latin America is all new territory for me. I have spent my entire career as an Asia specialist and really know nothing about Latin America. So in order to try to say something that would be of interest to people in Latin America, I'm going to start with the story that I know, which is a story about Asia. And it's a story that I can tell graphically. And in parallel, I have created all of the same graphs using data for Latin America. So we will go step by step through the story on Asia and look at the graphs for Latin America. And it really will be up to you as an audience who knows something about Latin America to fill in the parallel story just by looking at the data and referencing what has happened in East Asia. As Roberto said, I'm writing a textbook. It's called Macroeconomics for Emerging East Asia, which is in the title of this presentation for today. Let me talk a little bit about the motivation for that textbook as a way to set up the topic for this session. The textbook dates to my experience teaching at the National University of Singapore, and this goes back more years than I would like to think that it would take me to write a textbook, but I'm making progress and getting close to the end at this point. Many years ago, teaching at the National University of Singapore, it was a public policy program for master's students who were from all over Asia, a few other countries beyond Asia, but mostly students from Asia. And the textbook that had been chosen for me was a standard US macroeconomics textbook. And in fact, throughout Asia, economics is studied using US textbooks. I don't know about in Latin America, whether you use US textbooks, but globally, they seem to dominate. And for microeconomics, that's probably okay. The story about markets, competition, so forth, that translates pretty well from the United States to the rest of the world, but not so for macroeconomics. macroeconomics in Asia is an entirely different thing from macroeconomics in the United States. So I felt in using a US textbook that we were really wasting our time. I was wasting my time and wasting the time of the students. They were in Singapore, they should be learning about Asia, and they were learning about America, and the lessons did not transfer in macroeconomics. About the same time, this was 2006, 2007, 2008, China was taking a lot of flack about its exchange rate policies. And I felt that that was undeserved. I really feel like, and I find ways to bring this into my textbook, I felt like China handled its exchange rate really very well through the 2000s, and for a good long while handled its exchange rate very well. No doubt they stabilized it, and it was under pressure to rise, and they resisted that for quite a long time, but I think that that was a good move on their part. So I wrote a series of op-ed pieces for the Wall Street Journal arguing in support of China's exchange rate policies. And this tension with the United States calling China out for being a currency manipulator went on for some time. And after a few of these pieces over a period of years, the editor of the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal said to me, "Does anybody agree with you?" And really, it seemed like I was a lone voice, but I was able to say Ronald McKinnon agrees with me. So I could think of somebody who was also a supporter of China's exchange rate policies. But I think it goes back to, there's not a textbook that says that this is what countries in emerging markets, and certainly countries in Asia, are doing and should be doing, and that they have figured out what to do and are handling the macroeconomic external balances, internal balances, all of the pressures, the volatility, handling it pretty well. So I really felt that this needed to be said. There needed to be a textbook. I probably could not have written it on my own without the wise counsel of a colleague that I had at the National University of Singapore, who had retired from the IMF. His name was Charles Adams. And the two of us were tasked with designing an executive program in macroeconomics, which we taught in Vietnam, and I think he later taught in some other places. And so by working with him to structure this executive program, he was able to impart his wisdom to me, and I was able to grasp enough of it that I thought we should write the textbook together. And he agreed to that, and we got a start. Unfortunately, he did not live long enough to carry through and left me to do it on my own. And I'm still working on that, but I draw upon the knowledge that he shared with me in every page of this book. And so it really does reflect what I learned from him. So in this executive program, what became very clear to me was the foundation, the core of what this book needed to do, what lessons we needed to teach. We have to think about an economy where external balances matter, exchange rates matter, debt sustainability matters. And none of these things matter in the United States. You don't find in a US textbook anything about external balances or exchange rates. Maybe the very last chapter, which you might get to and you might not get to in the course of a semester. Debt sustainability, that is not ever, does never register for macroeconomic policy in the United States. And so these issues are really central to thinking about how to approach macroeconomics in an emerging East Asian context. And so that we'll take a look at how the book is designed in this session today, and then pull out some of the core material and draw a parallel with Latin America graphically and see where we go from there. So with that, let me turn to the slides and share my screen. So let's start with an outline of the session today. The book motivation I've already talked about, and the structure of the book, we'll turn to that next. We'll then look at some charts involving summary statistics, comparing East Asia and Latin America. And then what's really central to the book, and particular very much to the emerging East Asia context, and different from what is in any American textbook, is the monetary policy and exchange rate frameworks. So we'll look at that from a standpoint of frameworks broadly and options that are available. And then we'll look at policy implementation with further graphical analysis involving foreign reserves and exchange rates. And then policy conclusions comparing what the ultimate graph looks like for East Asia, which is quite different from how the same data shape up graphically in Latin America. I'll refer here to the top of the screen. Macroeconomics for Emerging East Asia is the title of the book, and there is a website, and the link to the website is here, but if you can't pull out that link, it's very simple, just macroforasia.com. And I would love to get feedback from anybody who's interested in looking at that book. So the table of contents is here in the next slide, and right from the outset, you will see that this is structured very differently, excuse me, from a US textbook. So we have the introductory chapter, and then a broad empirical look at data from emerging East Asia. Microeconomic fundamentals chapter, and then we start with the national income and product accounts. And then what's very different here is the next chapter goes on to balance of payments accounts. So right from the outset, we lay the foundations to think about external balances, which is so important for emerging economies. And we next then need to bring in exchange rates, but first we need money and finance, and then chapter 8 is exchange rates. So the first 8 chapters lay the foundations. They give us the tools that we need to move on to thinking about the theory and the policy. Chapters 9 and 10 are theory chapters. Chapter 9 is comparative statics models, so very compressed into one chapter. We get the income expenditure model, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, ISLM. For students who haven't seen it before, it would be a lot to try to absorb, but I think the book is mainly aimed at students who have some background. And this is a quick review and overview to see what's different about each of these models and how does each approach the big issue of macroeconomic stability. And then chapter 10 is dynamic, the theories of business cycles. And then we move into the policy chapters, monetary policy, fiscal policy, macro policy for internal and external balance. So how do we combine these tools to achieve both internal and external balance and try to simultaneously get balance in both dimensions. And those chapters are now completed. So I'm working on chapter 14, which is macro-prudential policy, and very timely then a chapter on crises. And I'm glad that that chapter is not already written because we are learning as we go about crises right now. And I will be able to incorporate this current crisis into writing that chapter. And then the epilogue. I should mention, this is macroeconomics strictly focusing on fluctuations, on macroeconomic stabilization. So there is nothing in this textbook about long-run development and growth. That has to come from a separate book. So short-run fluctuations and stabilization policy. And for the discussion today, we will focus particularly on what is most central to the emerging East Asia context that really is missed entirely in an American macroeconomics textbook. So we'll focus on exchange rate and stabilization and monetary policy. And those two are very closely related and really require a lot of juggling and trading off between independent monetary policy and exchange rate stabilization, familiar to you from the trilemma. So let's move into some summary statistics. Let's see, let's see if I can, I'm seeing too much information on my screen. Okay. That cleared out some that was blocking. So some summary statistics, and we'll start with GDP shares. Looking at the East Asia figure first, should note here that Japan is not included. I've framed this as emerging East Asia, but I do include some very advanced economies such as Singapore and Hong Kong. Japan is a little different. Japan operates more like the United States and Europe, whereas for all of the rest of these countries, I can tell a coherent story within the framework of a single textbook that doesn't quite apply to Japan, certainly doesn't apply to the United States, doesn't apply very well to the Eurozone. So Japan is excluded, and with Japan excluded, we see that in East Asia, China really has an overwhelmingly dominant position. Next largest economy is Korea, then Indonesia. Indonesia has a large population, low per capita income. Taiwan, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, very advanced financial centers, Malaysia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Although the last three will drop out of most of the analysis because the data are not very good. They are very low income economies. The data collection is not very good, and the policy analysis, the policy management is not as sophisticated as in most of the rest of emerging East Asia. So on the Latin America side, I selected economies mainly based on GDP size. So we've got the largest and some of the higher per capita incomes that I will be including in the data sample for the empirical analysis. Again, there are a couple of economies that really are much larger and dominate in the region, but probably not in the same way that China and Japan going back historically have dominated in Asia, where Japan especially played a role of developing supply chains within Asia. And with these economies in Asia developing in a very export-oriented, outward-looking way, Japan really played a pivotal role early on in laying the foundations for that, in a way that probably no country has played in Latin America. But there clearly is a similarity in that Brazil is quite large relative to the other economies in the region, and then Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Panama, and Costa Rica, and Uruguay are the countries that I started out with. But not all of them will make it through, for various reasons, to the full analysis of data. GDP per capita, I think here we see one of the patterns that will come through repeatedly. East Asia has tremendous variation. Latin America, the countries in this sample are much more similar to each other. Nevertheless, even with the great diversity in East Asia, the same story can be told. A single textbook can quite effectively, I would argue, be applied to telling a story that is is relevant for all of these economies. In East Asia, Singapore and Hong Kong, obviously very high income, advanced countries. Per capita income in Singapore of 65,000 US dollars a year, Hong Kong close to $50,000 a year, Korea and Taiwan also very high, relatively high income economies. And we don't see anything comparable to that on the Latin America side. But now moving along, East Asia, Malaysia, China. China has obviously climbed the per capita income chart very quickly over the last few decades compared to where it started out a few decades ago. Then Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. It's been quite distressing to people in the Philippines that this year Vietnam is expected to surpass the Philippines in terms of per capita income. And then much lower down, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Over on the Latin America side, we see a much more compressed distribution of per capita income. And Brazil lies in the middle of that range of countries at about 8,000 US dollars a year, or 8.8 thousand US dollars a year. Next chart does a comparison on goods and services trade relative to GDP. Again, for the East Asian economies, we see tremendous differentiation. So Hong Kong and Singapore, again, at the top of the chart, ratios of exports and imports to GDP above 150%. And then we move on down from there. Vietnam has developed very rapidly on the basis of an strong export orientation. Malaysia, Taiwan, Cambodia, quite high trade ratios to GDP. Thailand, all of these countries have higher ratios of trade to GDP until we get down to about Korea. Then we start to see something comparable to the ratios in Latin America. So Latin America is less outward oriented on the whole than most of East Asian economies are. Another difference between the two regions is that in East Asia, most of the economies are running trade surpluses for goods and services. So looking down the line, Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, all running trade surpluses. Cambodia roughly in balance, Thailand surplus, Korea, Myanmar in balance. Philippines is the first one that we come to that runs a fairly large trade deficit, but there's a catch here because Philippines has a very large part of its labor force that is working overseas. And so that, in a sense, they're exporting labor services, and they generate a lot of funds flowing back to the Philippines that in the current account more broadly brings the balance closer to being equal. Then China, China has a quite small, this is should not be 2010 here. I think I forgot to update the year on this table. I think this is actually 2019. Most of my data, you'll notice are 2019. And I think that this is just an error in the slide. China, although in absolute terms, because its economy is so large, its export surplus in absolute terms is quite large, but small relative to GDP. If we look at Latin America, we see some balanced trade, and we see more countries that are running trade deficits. Not necessarily a bad thing, but different from emerging East Asia. And Brazil has it's a large economy, so we don't expect it to have trade ratios that are as high relative to GDP as smaller economies, and trade is close to being in balance there. And finally, for the descriptive statistics, the international investment position, there's more detail here than we will have time to go into. But we're breaking down assets and liabilities, external assets and liabilities, by direct investment, portfolio investment. Derivatives is trivial in both of these regions, so we can ignore that. Other is loans and deposits, and then reserves is the official reserves of the central bank. So that shows up only on the asset side. I think we'll resist the temptation to go into detail, but highlight the fact, I'll also clarify here that because these top three economies, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, because the numbers are so large, I have scaled differently the graph for these three economies relative to the rest of emerging East Asia, which is scaled in the same magnitude as Latin America. So the numbers here are extremely large, and that's not surprising for Hong Kong and Singapore. They are international financial centers. A lot of money comes in, a lot of money goes out. They have very large asset and liabilities. Of note beyond that, though, they have very large net surplus positions. Assets exceed liabilities. And Taiwan, we can bring in there too. Taiwan is also in this more highly scaled breakout graph. And Taiwan has extremely large assets relative to its relative to its international liability position. For the most part in emerging East Asia, assets exceed liabilities, and when we move down into the lower segment of the graph, that also holds true. With the exception of Cambodia, which is a very low income country and has incurred a lot of liabilities already relative to assets. Korea, substantial surplus here. Thailand about in balance. China, substantial positive net assets. Philippines and Indonesia and Myanmar are net debtor countries. In Latin America, by contrast, we see here in every case, I believe, except Argentina. Argentina is a net creditor, but in every other case, we see that the countries are net debtors, including Brazil, which is right here, and on down the line. So we get a sense of the differences, and we'll sum up here in the next slide. Size and per capita income, East Asia is extremely diverse. Latin America lies within a more narrow range. Trade, East Asia shares to GDP are generally much higher than Latin America. And generally, trade is in surplus, whereas for Latin America, the trade balance is more mixed. And finally, international investment position. Hong Kong and Singapore are extreme outliers. They are city-states, or Hong Kong we can no longer call a city-state, but it's a separate economy in that it has its own currency and its own customs territory, and we can delineate it as an economy. And East Asia has major net creditors and some net debtors. Latin America has all net debtors, but for Argentina. So now we want to think about policy frameworks, and it all rests on the trilemma, for thinking about what the options are for managing internal and external balance, thinking about the exchange rate and the balance of payments, and also domestically, the output gap and the inflation rate all need to come into the picture. And with the trilemma, the basic idea here is that you cannot have all three of, you can have only at most two of exchange rate stabilization, open capital markets, and monetary policy independence. Now, within this range of choices, Hong Kong and Singapore have abandoned any monetary policy independence. They fix their monetary policy based on the exchange rate. In Hong Kong, that's done with a hard peg to the US dollar. In Singapore, the exchange rate is managed, but the interest rate is not in any sense a policy instrument. Singapore's financial markets are too globally open. It is entirely exposed to global interest rates, and that is not something that, from a policy standpoint, Singapore has any leeway to manipulate. So the exchange rate is the instrument of policy, of stabilization policy for Singapore. And both of those economies, of course, have entirely open capital markets. So they are on the right lateral side of the trilemma triangle. China's capital markets are not as open as the rest of the region. China still imposes capital controls, especially on money leaving. And if you can't take your money out, you're reluctant to send your money in. So China has capital controls, which gives it a lot more leeway to pursue both exchange rate stabilization and a separate independent monetary policy. And just to think about what it means to be on the bottom of the triangle, we're really looking at the advanced economies here, monetary policy independence and open capital markets with no attention whatsoever to exchange rate stabilization. So on the bottom length of the triangle, we're thinking about the US, Japan, and the Eurozone. So for thinking about emerging East Asia, given open capital markets, monetary and exchange rate policies are interdependent. And that doesn't mean that economies in emerging East Asia fix on one or the other. In fact, what they do is constantly juggle between the two. They are always trading off the desire to stabilize the exchange rate against the desire to have monetary policy independence. So there's a fair degree of flexibility in exchange rates, but not full flexibility in exchange rates. And they walk a path of pulling one way and then pulling the other way. And that's what we're going to look at in the coming slides. So let's think about how we interpret a response to a shock, and the shock that we can think about, because it is a constant struggle to deal with, is the shock of capital flows when you have open capital markets. So global capital coming in, global capital going out. How do you respond to this? Well, let's consider a capital inflow first. A capital inflow will put upward pressure on the local currency. And as the local currency appreciates, exports tend to fall, imports tend to rise, causing more competition with domestic production. And that has a depressing effect on GDP growth. So capital inflows are destabilizing and they are deflationary, and there's a strong impetus then to try to respond to this and forestall the ramifications that we see playing out here. Central banks can intervene to stabilize the exchange rate, and this means the central bank buys foreign exchange as it's coming in. That then means that reserves increase, the money supply increases, interest rates fall, and that provides a stimulus to GDP growth. So this counters the deflationary effect of the capital inflow itself, and yet it pushes a response to give up control of monetary policy and interest rates and subordinate that to the desire to stabilize the exchange rate. One of the other big problems of capital inflows is that money can turn around and flow back out. And that's very much part of the concern when global capital comes in. What's going to happen when it turns around and goes out? And when it goes out, that tends to put downward pressure on the local currency. That's good for exports, not so good for imports, which may take pressure off competition from domestic producers. And that is a stimulus to growth and perhaps also to inflation. But it's not all good news. The drawback there is that as the local currency depreciates, it becomes harder to pay interest on debt and pay back debts that have been incurred. There again, there's a need to try to balance, to try to keep the exchange rate and the balance of payments on more of an even keel. The central bank can intervene in this case by selling foreign exchange. Reserves then contract, the money supply contracts, interest rates rise, and GDP growth goes down. So that offsets the initial shock of inflationary impact on GDP growth and stabilizes the exchange rate. But the story here is that independent monetary policy now has had to be sacrificed. Now we're making a distinction here between a central bank having some leeway to absorb shocks versus long-run balance of payments equilibrium or disequilibrium. So if there is a positive shock to the balance of payments, you can intervene as long as it's a shock. But if it's a permanent condition that fundamentals have changed to result in a sustained balance of payments surplus, then this effort to stabilize is going to run into problems. So the strategy in emerging East Asia is to intervene in damping down the shocks that tend to push an exchange rate above or below an equilibrium level, appreciating that it's hard to recognize what the equilibrium level is longer term, but in principle, that's the idea, that intervention will take place in order to stabilize, but that a sustainable long-run equilibrium path will ultimately be adhered to. So exchange rate, prices, and interest rates all have to align with that. They have to move in sync with a sustainable equilibrium path. Now, what do economies in East Asia and in Latin America actually do? Well, we can look to the IMF classification system to see how economies choose a strategy within the framework of the trilemma within the need to either fix the exchange rate or allow the exchange rate to fluctuate and follow an independent monetary policy, or try to find some middle ground and have some of both of those options. So this classification from the IMF distinguishes three broad types of exchange rate regime. And the broad types of regime over here on the left are a hard peg, a soft peg, or a floating exchange rate. And within those broad categories, we then have subcategories of more specificity. So hard peg, well, we don't see this in Asia, but in Latin America, there are two economies from the sample of economies that I started out with that actually do not have a separate legal tender. They have given up an independent currency and just make use of the US dollar. So they're actually going to drop out of the analysis for purposes of this presentation henceforward. If they don't have an exchange rate, we can't really say much about them within this framework. But Hong Kong in Asia also has a hard peg, and that is a hard peg to the US dollar. It's held this hard peg for close to 40 years. So it is a very firm commitment of long-standing peg to the US dollar. Within the next band here, the soft peg band, Vietnam has an exchange rate anchor to a composite, a basket of currencies, rather than a single currency. And then a crawl-like arrangement, Singapore also has an exchange rate anchor, which is a composite. And the monetary authority in Singapore sets a direction for that. So it's not a firm peg, it's a crawling peg. And the monetary authority at regular intervals reassesses that crawl and determines whether to raise the rate of appreciation or lower the rate of appreciation as an instrument for managing macroeconomic stability. And Dominican Republic is often also categorized as having a crawl-like arrangement. And then other managed pegs, Cambodia, China, and Myanmar. Cambodia has a US dollar anchor, and China and Myanmar have managed exchange rates and use a target. Unlike this next group, which uses inflation targeting, China and Myanmar use monetary aggregates as their policy targeting instrument. And then finally, we have a floating exchange rate, but that doesn't necessarily mean free floating. So there is a further distinction here of floating with the idea that the exchange rate is over the medium to long term, it is market determined. But in the short run, fluctuations can be damped down. The monetary authority intervenes to buy or sell and to keep the exchange rate on a more stable course. Whoops, sorry, let's go back to that. Argentina uses a monetary aggregate target. This next, many countries in both Latin America and emerging East Asia use inflation targeting. That means they commit to meeting an inflation target of some band, usually on the order of 3, 4, 5%, something in that range. And that is their guiding principle, which does not necessarily mean that they don't intervene in the exchange rate, in the foreign exchange market. There's no conflict there necessarily between inflation targeting and exchange rate stabilization. So there's leeway here still to to do that within the concept of floating but not free floating. Malaysia and Taiwan. Taiwan is not categorized by the IMF, but by looking at the central bank website, it's clear that they also follow a policy of exchange rate floating. Not inflation targeting, however, they have a broader set of goals, as does the US. The US is said to have a dual mandate, domestic inflation stabilization, but also an employment and output gap mandate. And then finally, within Latin America, we do find two countries that are classified as having free floating exchange rates, Chile and Mexico, and we don't see that in emerging East Asia. Now let's look at the data and see what that actually means for policy implementation. The first chart here shows official reserves, central bank foreign reserves, relative to GDP. And again, these graphs are scaled the same. And what immediately jumps out is that East Asia has a widely differentiated range of situations. And Latin America is much more narrowly confined. Countries are much more similar to each other. So within East Asia, we see some countries that have enormous reserves relative to GDP. Now, Hong Kong is a special case because its monetary base is entirely backed by US dollars. It has a fixed peg to the US dollar, and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority stands fully equipped and ready to convert Hong Kong dollars to US dollars. Its monetary base is fully backed, and it's in a position to do that. So that is the principle on which its exchange rate policy rests. But other economies in the region also have very large official reserves relative to GDP. Now, the history here is that after the Asian financial crisis, 1997-98, it really sent a scare through the region. Many economies in the region, starting with Thailand, moving on to Indonesia and Korea, saw their currency values collapse in the Asian financial crisis. And the lesson that drove home was that if they had reserves on hand, they could defend their currencies against capital outflows that would cause a collapse in their exchange rates. And so as a matter of prudence, they recognized that they needed to be prepared for that, having been caught short in 1997. And there was a concerted effort to build reserves. And part of what's involved is also that by keeping their exchange rates, by keeping their currencies a bit undervalued, it helps to promote exports. And that's been part of the development strategy too. By contrast, when we look over here at Latin America, we see much smaller reserve positions relative to GDP, really other than Peru and maybe Uruguay, pretty much where East Asia leaves off down here is where Latin America begins on the continuum. So that gives you some sense of the context in which a central bank may be able to act to intervene in foreign exchange markets. Now, this graph shows what the central banks actually have done over a period from 2008 to 2019. And we're looking here at the change in reserves measured on the balance of payments. So I'm looking at a flow concept as reflected in the balance of payments. We're looking at interpreting this as how much the central bank has intervened in the foreign exchange market. And here, actually, since we're measuring these interventions as a percent of reserves, Now we know that Latin America has much lower denominator here. Magnitude of reserves is less. But in percentage terms, we see these graphs look fairly similar. I mean, Argentina looks different from everybody else. A lot of reserve outflows in Argentina. And it's also the case that Argentina's exchange rate has fluctuated wildly, so much so that it really doesn't fit into the graph going forward. And we're going to drop Argentina from the next stage of the analysis. What emerges out of both of these regions is that most of the weight of these graphs is on the right hand side, on the positive side. So for the most part, central banks have been accumulating foreign reserves. So they've been buying dollars and selling local currency, and the weight of the graph is overwhelmingly in that positive side. And that's true for both regions. But what we also notice is that there's tremendous variability from year to year. These lines are really jumping all over the place from year to year. And in both regions, sometimes they move pretty deeply negative. So selling of foreign reserves, buying of local currency, and moving in this direction. So there the two regions look more similar than they have in other respects. But now we're going to look at this with respect to simultaneously what is happening with the exchange rate. And this is really the cumulative graph on which we will compare approaches to policy in the two regions. And I think immediately, without thinking about what we're measuring on the axes or anything, these graphs really look strikingly different. East Asia is much more compressed and much more closely adhering to a pattern. And Latin America, much more dispersed. The scatter plot is really all over the place, and it's not clear that we have, if this were a regression line, it's not clear that we would get a statistically significant coefficient there. It looks like probably not. Whereas for East Asia, we probably would. So let's delve into what's going on here. In the vertical dimension, we're measuring the change in reserves, and this comes directly out of that last graph. So these are the same numbers. And in that respect, again, we note most of the points in the plot are in the positive space. That is, central banks are accumulating foreign reserves and to a lesser degree, they're selling off foreign reserves down here in the negative half of the graph. And then on the horizontal axis, we are measuring the exchange rate in terms of local currency relative to the US dollar. And so moving to the right, we're looking at depreciation. It takes more local currency per US dollar. So we're getting depreciation moving to the right, appreciation moving to the left. So with that, we can interpret the pattern here that we see in the East Asian context. And clearly, there's a tendency when the currency is depreciating, when the local currency is depreciating, to sell off foreign reserves and buy local currency. In other words, to prop up, to lean against the wind is the expression as the currency is depreciating. And the opposite over on this end, as the currency is appreciating, to buy dollars and sell local currency and forestall that appreciation. So again, leaning against the wind. And East Asia has a method here. They have an act down where they're behaving quite systematically in their foreign exchange market intervention to lean against currency movements going either toward appreciation or toward depreciation. We don't see any activity over here in this lower left quadrant. And insofar as generally we see a tendency to accumulate foreign exchange reserves, we don't see any activity going way out here. So there's a space here where we see positive change in reserves in association with some depreciation, but we don't see anybody way out here like we do for Latin America. Latin America appears to be engaging, central banks be engaging in a much more random fashion with regard to what's happening with the exchange rate. So with a point that's way out here, how do we interpret that? Well, the currency is depreciating, and yet the central bank is buying foreign reserves and selling local currencies. So they're selling the local currency into a depreciating environment and either causing or amplifying that depreciation. And that we don't see that kind of behavior in East Asia. So we see some kind of downward slope, but we see points way out here. And it's always interesting to think about the outliers. And we have Brazil in a position of outlier in a couple of cases. So in 2009, the Brazilian real was appreciating, and the response to that was very much an East Asian type of response. The central bank is buying foreign reserves against that appreciation, so selling local currency, buying foreign reserves. Currency is appreciating, but the central bank is moderating that appreciation, and in the process accumulating foreign reserves. And central banks like to have some stock of foreign reserves. This is a good time to get it when the currency is appreciating. So that fits the East Asian model. In 2015, though, we see an outlier for Brazil with depreciation of the real, and the central bank doesn't do anything. That depreciation is market driven. The central bank doesn't intervene, no change in reserves at all, and a depreciation of almost 50%. So I promised you at the outset that I would not try to interpret what was going on in Latin America, and I'm going to stay away from that. You know a lot more about it than I do. And I'll leave that for you to discuss. But we have one more slide, one more graphical slide that looks at Brazil in more detail. The last graph was annual data, and this graph is quarterly data. So we see finer gradations to the fluctuations and to central bank intervention. So we can capture things at a quarterly level that we didn't see at the annual level. So outliers were 2009 and 2015. So let's mention 2008. 2008, at the annual level, we didn't pick up as an outlier because first there was a sharp appreciation and then a depreciation. But we did pick up 2009, and we noted that the currency was appreciating and the central bank was accumulating foreign reserves against that, and we see that here. Now moving on, actually, the currency is, here we've got the real, the near, and the US dollar, but they're all tending to move pretty much together, so we don't need to differentiate and tell a story about that. We see modest appreciation over the next couple of years, 2010, 2011, and we see the central bank accumulating foreign reserves. So This is a good time to take advantage of appreciation to build a foreign reserve cash if there's a need for that. And then depreciation starts to set in, and by 2015, the depreciation really is quite sharp. But the central bank does not act on that, on what's going on in the foreign exchange market, and in fact keeps a pretty low profile, but the exchange rate appreciates again, more or less stabilizes. And here in 2019, the end of 2019, the central bank reserves, central bank is selling off reserves and holding stability in the exchange rate. So it looks like there was a tendency for depreciation, but the central bank intervened, sold foreign reserves, bought local currency, and kept stability in the exchange rate here. So that is a story that is told purely on the basis of interpreting numbers without knowing anything about the context more broadly of what was going on in Brazil, and that is what you know and I don't. To summarize here then, emerging East Asia, there is something of a science or an art, a technique that East Asia has honed of balancing exchange rate stabilization and monetary policy independence. So they give in to the central bank intervening to stabilize the exchange rate when we see strong tendency toward appreciation or depreciation. And otherwise, the exchange rate is market determined in a longer run sense. And the expression leaning against the wind is applied to this. So response to balance of payment shocks, a positive balance of payment shock, central bank mitigates the currency appreciation by accumulating foreign reserves, and the money supply then goes up as a consequence of that, unless there's sterilization, which we haven't gotten into here, but that's another element of the picture more broadly. And everything runs in reverse for a negative balance of payment shock. And then Latin America, much more variability in both reserves and exchange rates. And we had to leave Argentina out of the picture altogether because it was way off the chart. And only a very loose correlation between reserves and exchange rates. It might be tempting. I'm going to put this out there, and if this idea may get shot down, it might be tempting to say that emerging East Asia has figured something out, that there's a rhyme and a reason to what they're doing, and maybe Latin America can learn from that. But I'm putting that out there with, as I've said, no foundation, no understanding of what's going on in Latin America. And maybe there's nothing that can be learned from this at all. So I'll leave that up to you to figure out. And with that, I think the time is up and the presentation is up. And thank you. So it's open for discussion as far as I'm concerned. And Roberto, I'll let you take that on.
Thank you, Kela, for this wonderful presentation. So we have now some time for questions and discussion on the subject. So if anyone has a question, please let us know. So let me start with a question then. You were talking that is this difference between Latin America that is more random and that East Asia, they are more behaving the same way. And also there is more correlation between the interventions in East Asia than in Latin America. Is these interventions, if there are, or when there is inflow or outflow of resources of foreign capital, or there are big changes in the exchange rate, or you have to make the sterilization. If you make sterilization of these of the inflow or outflows, you have changes in the internal debt. Is this an issue for East Asia?
Well, if they're going to sterilize, I mean, there are real limitations to how long you can pursue sterilization under open capital markets. There's a cost to the central bank to sterilize. If the central bank is incurring domestic liabilities at a higher interest rate than the return on the foreign assets that it acquires. I've lost you visually, Roberto. Yeah, I feel like I'm talking to you if you turn off your camera. A sustained sterilization is not a possibility. If an economy, and in my textbook, I actually look at it both an Indonesian case and a Chinese case of sterilization. And if it's a case where there has been a sharp capital inflow, it's a positive shock to the balance of payments. And the central bank intervenes to buy foreign currency, and then it offsets that by in its domestic assets. It can do that temporarily, but it can't do that in a sustained way, because the impetus for the shock is still there. So if capital is flowing in, and the central bank acts to stabilize interest rates, that what was driving that capital inflow is still going to be pulling a capital inflow. So by intervening to buy foreign exchange, sell local currency, expand the money supply, the interest rate is going to fall domestically. And that is what it takes to stop the capital inflow from coming. And if the central bank intervenes to sustain a high interest rate domestically, the capital inflow is, in principle, that money, whatever was driving it, is still attractive if the interest rate is high. So by sterilizing, you prevent the equilibrating process that needs to take place to counter that shock that caused the disruption to the exchange rate in the first place. So if it's a temporary shock, you might be able to use that technique, and then be ready on the reverse side. If the capital is going to flow back out, then the central bank is ready to sell into that and run the process in reverse. So for countries with open capital markets, the process of equilibration needs to take place. And if the central bank sterilizes, then it doesn't happen. They forestall that. And the disequilibrium doesn't correct itself. China's a different case. China was able to, for years and years and years, run very large trade surpluses, keep its exchange rate, and I have fought back against this, but I'm going to go with it for the moment. Keep its exchange rate undervalued, accumulate foreign reserves. So running a trade surplus and accumulating foreign reserves, and sterilizing that. So accumulating foreign reserves, but keeping domestic interest rates, managing domestic interest rates independently. China was able to do this because it didn't have open capital markets. So China could sterilize, pursue monetary policy on one hand, pursue exchange rate management on the other hand, and preserve a disequilibrium there for a period of many years because its capital markets were not open. Did I answer your question?
Perfectly, perfect. Thank you. Professor Keller, we have a question on the chat. The question is from Professor Cleomar Gomes, and he asks, Dr. Calawimir, congratulations on your presentation. Your PhD dissertation analyzes the schistosomosis control progress in China. What made you move from that to becoming an expert in Asia's macroeconomics?
The question was, I started out doing work on China and I moved into something entirely different, huh?
Yes.
There's a big story here, and I have to keep it short. And I don't know if the questioner has some knowledge of what was involved, but it's true. I started out as a China specialist. I went to China to do dissertation research in 1979, and I continued as a China specialist for the next couple of decades. One thing led to another. I did research on China's western region of Xinjiang and contributed a chapter on the economy of Xinjiang, which if you pay attention to the news on China lately, is getting a lot of very bad press in the Western media for suppression of a minority group, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And so the region is very sensitive. It's historically predominantly Muslim, non-Han Chinese, so a Turkic language and population ethnically more in akin with Central Asia than the eastern part of China. Anyway, it's a very sensitive region for China, and everyone who contributed to this academic volume on Xinjiang was blacklisted as a result. So I found myself blacklisted as a career China specialist beginning in 2003, which is why, in fact, I went to Singapore and thought that probably things would calm down and I would get back into China. And I tried for 7 years and ended up back in Los Angeles, which was where I met you in 2010, and have been able to get a number of visas, but it's not easy. My last 2 visas going into China have been at the invitation of the Philippine ambassador to China. So it takes a very high level of pull. And interestingly, the US State Department has tried many times to push the Chinese government to issue visas, not just to me, but to other contributors to this volume. And to my knowledge, the State Department has not been effective at all, the US State Department. Whereas the Philippine ambassador has been able to request a visa for me from the Chinese government and succeeded my last 2 attempts. Was 2018 and 2019. In both those years, I went briefly. Anyway, having found myself exiled as a career China specialist, I was really pushed to broaden my perspective, to broaden my interest in the world. And that turned out, I think now, looking back, to be a good thing. So I have had to learn more about the rest of Asia and become more of a pan-Asia specialist. And then the teaching in Singapore really was what pushed me to think that there is a great crying need for a macroeconomics textbook on Asia. And so nobody else wrote it, I'm writing it.
Thank you.
I don't know if you were aware of all that story. I think you were aware of some of that, huh?
Some of that I was, yes. Yeah. But Cleomar wasn't.
Okay.
So any questions more? Well, I still have questions. After the corona pandemics this year, we saw around the world a lot of interventions by the states in order to keep the output not falling that much. Yeah. Did you see differences between what happens in East Asia and in the developed countries in terms of the strategies like expenditures or tax exemptions in these operation of the fiscal policy?
Yeah, I think East Asia has been pretty well positioned going into this, and I don't know about Latin America. Well positioned in the sense that for the most part, the fiscal debt to GDP ratios have been in safe ranges. So they have some fiscal space, and they're using it. They have to use it. If you have fiscal space and you don't use it now, and the Philippines probably has been among the most cautious, and a lot of people are advocating for much more aggressive government spending. Philippines historically had very high debt to GDP ratios, and it took a very concerted effort over a long period of time to bring those debt to GDP ratios down to now, if I remember right, something on the order in the 30% of GDP. So well within safe ranges. They've got a lot of space, but they've not been very aggressive in using that. Malaysia has relatively high government debt to GDP ratios and probably has been more aggressive than Singapore in using that space. But everybody now, the problem is that if you let businesses go under in this situation, it might be very hard to recover from that. And so the risk of overextending fiscally or overextending with credit creation and money and potentially causing inflation on down the line has to be weighed against the more immediate risk of businesses failing in vast numbers and people losing jobs in vast numbers. And if that happens, the greater the difficulty of recovering if businesses have to be rebuilt from scratch. So I think aggressive fiscal and monetary policy, there's a real need for it right now. Countries that have fiscal space, that have had long sustained low inflation rates and expectations of inflation are low, it is time to move aggressively, and some countries are doing that more so than others. But this is all in motion right now, so it will be a lot easier to look back a year from now and evaluate what was done and what were the consequences of that.
Well, we have another very interesting question on the chat. I think it will be easier if you open the chat.
Do you think that the political instability in Hong Kong is likely to translate as an economic crisis in the region, or political instability in one country is unlikely to spread to another in the East Asian context? Yeah, the Hong Kong situation, I think, is very worrisome. Hong Kong has so long guarded so carefully its position as a global financial center, and that's why it has a fixed exchange rate, in order to give certainty to financial players that we know what the exchange rate will be. It's been there for 40 years almost, and to give certainty. Hong Kong actually has stricter disclosure laws for listing on the stock market than the United States does, and they have held to that with Chinese companies listing. So they've been extremely mindful of how important it is to ensure confidence in the financial markets in Hong Kong, and that they are independent, and that the exchange rate policy can be relied on. And very much, that requires a sense that information is open, that the court system works in an impartial way, and all of that is under threat, clearly under threat. And some news organizations like the New York Times have moved a large part of their staff out of Hong Kong to Korea. So real worries about freedom of information and an impartial court system. And without those things, I don't think that you can sustain a global financial center. So I think it's very ominous for Hong Kong, the foundation of Hong Kong's economy, which is finance, under these circumstances, that it can be contained. And yet, if we look 20, 30 years ago, Hong Kong economy was very large relative to the mainland Chinese economy. And of course, China's economy has grown so rapidly that mainland China now has an overwhelmingly large economy. They have their own very large financial centers in Shanghai and Shenzhen. It may be a calculated risk to the Chinese government that they don't need Hong Kong in that role so much anymore, that they have grown, developed their own financial centers, built their own economy. The vital role that Hong Kong played in an earlier stage, maybe they feel that they can sacrifice. I think as far as whether there would be spillovers for the rest of Asia of the demise of Hong Kong, I think maybe it works the other way, that the rest of Asia is ready to take over that role. You know, Singapore also has a very strong financial center. Tokyo's a financial center. And of course, you know, Shanghai is a financial center. So I don't think a loss of confidence in Hong Kong necessarily will translate to a loss of confidence in Tokyo or Singapore or Malaysia, let's say, as a financial center where they're focusing on Islamic development of Islamic finance. So I'm not as worried about that, but Hong Kong, I'm really very much worried about Hong Kong. And do we have another question that I should look at?
Yes.
Okay, focusing on the Vietnamese case, what are the main reasons for Vietnam's recent development? Do you think Vietnam can be seen as a new Asian tiger? Well, Vietnam is interesting, and especially from the perspective here in the Philippines. There's been a real sense that although the Philippines has done well, growth has been right around 6% for almost a decade now, which is, by Philippine historic standards, is really good, but by the super performers of the Asia historical experience, where they've had double-digit growth sustained for periods of years, it's not in that league. And Vietnam is more in that league, and the Philippines looks to that and says, you know, what are they doing? Vietnam, is much more in the mode of China, and has kind of taken on some of the low-wage spin-off manufacturing that is leaving China, looking for someplace else to go, and Vietnam is an attractive place to go. So much comes out of the Chinese tradition of a communist state-planned economy. So a much heavier role for the state, history of state-owned enterprises, you know, a government that can come in and manage the virus and control people's movements and keep that well contained. They can manage things like that. A good education system, much better, frankly, for the broad masses of people. If you look at broad indications of literacy and numeracy and school test performance, Vietnam does very well. So Vietnam has, and I think there's also the history with the United States. The United States feels a certain affinity toward Vietnam, a certain, maybe a need to make amends for the history with Vietnam. You know, a lot of people who were there during the war who now look at Vietnam as a promising country, and businesses are interested in Vietnam. They're interested in investing there. That it has a much heavier role of government planning is not necessarily a drawback to foreign investors who want stability, want government to be in control. And so Vietnam has attracted foreign investment. Much of that foreign investment is oriented toward export production. And that was the China model. And Vietnam has pursued that very successfully. Some people say that it is about at the limit of that, of where low-wage manufacturing driven by foreign direct investment and exports, where that can take them. And now wages are rising. You have to move up the technology ladder. That's the next step. And can Vietnam do that and continues to sustain growth? So a new Asian tiger, yeah. Vietnam has done very well and is continuing to do well. I'd rather live in the Philippines, though. I'm tired of repressive governments.
So any question more? We have still time. Kala, is there this as the economic policies in the East Asian economies, as you told us in the presentation, are similar? Yes, they are kind of the same. Is there any political coordination to get this, or is this any economic independence and anyone is doing what is best for himself and they arrive at the same result?
There is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and +3 now. So they've added China, Japan, and Korea to the ASEAN group of 10. Originally 5, expanded to 10, so that's Southeast Asia, and now ASEAN +3. I think the US made a huge mistake by pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because that allowed China to step up and lead the effort to organize another regional trade agreement. So RCEP, RCEP, regional, can't think of it right now, but China has now put into place a regional free trade area. The US missed the opportunity, and China stepped in and took over. So free trade agreements have been organized regionally. Of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Japan and Australia took over and pushed that forward without the United States. So there is still that organization without the United States. So coordinating with free trade agreements. I think, if we go back in history, Japan was really instrumental many decades ago in offshoring a lot of its manufacturing as wages rose, the yen appreciated in value. Japan found itself not competitive in a lot of the manufacturing that supported its takeoff. And so it really started the ball of regional supply chains and foreign direct investment within the region, and we're building on that. So I think the foundation is openness to trade, and there's been a lot of organizing in the region for that. There's been talk of coordination of macroeconomic policy, but that's not happening, and we're very far from that happening. And frankly, when people in this region look at Europe, they see, it's not so easy to sustain that. There's a lot of tensions, and that's not on the horizon at all, I don't think. Okay, US versus China. SG technology battle. How do the other Asian countries see this issue? Well, the whole trade war, I think other countries in Asia have looked for opportunities in that. So if the US is no longer going to buy from China, who will they buy from? What can we grab that China is not able to sell, and Vietnam has been a beneficiary of that. But the technology battle, so the U.S., for example, with Huawei, that's the big one, banning Huawei from buying U.S. chips or U.S. technology more broadly in any form, and pushing China as a consequence to say, if we can't buy this from the U.S., we better figure out how to build our own and develop those chips. And I don't know, to me, not knowing what the technology of a chip really is all about, it seems like they would be able to do that. But I guess the assessments are that China is a long ways from being able to produce the kinds of chips that it needs for its 5G technology, that, all of the cutting edge developments in the IT industry, that they depend on chip technology that is the province of the United States, and China now cannot get it. So I think, for the most part, certainly here in Southeast Asia, there's a sense to look for strategies to play the middle. Don't offend China. China's big and powerful, and we need China here in Southeast Asia. It's a market, we're part of the supply chain. We want to work with China. Prior to COVID, we wanted Chinese tourists, and someday again, I suppose that Chinese tourists will be sought by Southeast Asian countries. Tourism, is really a growth area in Southeast Asia. Lots of lovely beaches here. And so, don't offend China, but keep on good terms with the United States as well.
I have one last, I promise it's the last question, Carol, for you. You were telling that United States, Japan, and the Eurozone that are able to absorb shocks. And China will also be able to absorb the shock because they are getting huge in the market. But the imbalances in the world, in the long run, will they not affect the capability of absorbing shocks of the central or developed economies?
Not sure I followed the question. The absorbing shocks.
The US, Eurozone, and Japan are able to absorb shocks, but the United States, they have huge imbalances.
Yes.
And Japan sometimes has, and the European Union, will they be able to have this absorption capability in the long run?
Well, of course, we're all encountering a huge shock right now with the pandemic. I think Asia has learned from its past problems with shocks, particularly the Asian financial crisis, and has managed pretty well to get into a good space where it has room. So low debt to GDP ratios, both fiscal debt and external debt relative to GDP, reliance more on foreign direct investment rather than borrowing, or portfolio investment, and foreign direct investment, of course, is more stable. It doesn't, if it comes in, it doesn't easily go out. And so Southeast Asia, Asia in general, China as well, there's a lot of concern about high debt ratios in China. Not external debt, but domestic debt. Very high debt ratios within China. But many argue that it's not really a danger, that it's such a state-dominated economy. The financial system is dominated by state institutions. The corporate borrowers are dominated by state institutions. And so there will not be a panic. We have a crisis, financial crisis, when there's a panic and everybody's trying to sell. And since it's all domestic and it's all state managed, there's an argument to be made that there will be no panic, there will be no crisis, that fairly high debt loads can be sustained, and that the Chinese government can manage interest rates. It can manage defaults and not have people panic and credit markets freeze up. I think we're for what's happening now, we're in really all new territory. The aggressiveness with which fiscal and monetary policy must be pursued now on a global scale, it's really unprecedented. And you would think that if everybody is pursuing aggressive monetary policy on down the road, we're going to have inflation consequences of that. And we're going to have difficulty servicing debt as a result of that. Yet if we don't do it, we may have an even worse problem, with economies going into immediate, deep recessions. And so it seems that the best option is to be very aggressive about fiscal and monetary policy, and we have to deal with the consequences as we see them.
That's true. So we have time for one question more. It seems that not. So we are finishing our special session. We thank really for Carla for this wonderful presentation and productive discussion afterwards. So it was really good to have you, and we thank you for accepting our invitation. And as you told us,
I would like to learn more about Latin America someday, and maybe someday I'll come and visit you in Brazil, as you have let me know there is always an invitation there.
Marcel, would you tell us something?
Okay, thank you very much, Carla. We appreciate your efforts of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you also for all the attendees of this meeting. It was very good to have you all with us.
My pleasure.